Layoffs, tumbling truck sales, EV challenges, China troubles. The American auto giant is facing storms on every front and things don't look good. What is happening at GM and why is it hitting serious road bumps? Road bumps so big that the automaker is now fighting hard to save billions while facing ever-growing competition. Did GM really mess up this time and shock the car market? Let's find out. Job cuts and cost savings. If you look at just the numbers, it really looks like GM is one of the rare legacy automakers that's doing pretty well in the EV sector. The third quarter of the year ended with a massive 45% increase over the second quarter, with models like the Cadillac Lyriq counting for more than 20,000 units sold since the start of the year. It really looks like GM's EV sector is booming, but only until you scratch the surface. Then you realize that all of this comes at a huge cost and that America's major automaker is desperate to streamline the production process and finally break even. For that, it needs to save about $2 billion by the end of next year. To achieve that, the company announced a plan to lay off 1,000 workers by the end of 2024. These job cuts will mostly affect US workers and will include positions across various departments. Allegedly, most of these cuts are planned for the technical center in Warren, Michigan, but other plants will be affected as well. And while 1,000 jobs might not sound like a big deal for a company that employs over 150,000 workers globally, it's yet another episode of layoffs we've seen since last year as a part of the company's desperate attempt to optimize the production process. In April 2023, the company offered 5,000 voluntary buyouts, while the next round happened earlier this year, in August specifically, when more than 1,000 software workers were laid off. Just a month later, the company cut another 1,700 jobs at a Kansas plant, so we may conclude that this is already the third round of layoffs in the last several months. Officials didn't offer much of an explanation, except for phrases like, "We need to optimize for speed and excellence," or ensuring that we have the right team structure and focusing on our top priorities. Nothing in particular has been said so far. Lower fleet demand and pickup sales. Overall, GM's sales record for the third quarter this year seems okay. It's not ideal, but the 2.2% drop from the second quarter looks like something easy to tolerate. But if you take a closer look, you may notice a couple of quite concerning things. This particularly refers to fleet sales, which were notably lower compared to the same period last year. Compared to the third quarter 2023, fleet sales are 18% down, and that becomes quite concerning once you realize that this department usually accounts for about 20% of GM's total sales. Of course, most of the fleet sales go on pickup trucks, and while GM didn't divide figures in the last report, we could consider total pickup sales quite indicative. In the third quarter this year, Chevy sold a bit over 131,000 Silverado trucks, and that represents a notable 8.5% drop compared to the same period last year. When we take a look at heavy-duty models in which fleet sales have an even bigger share, you can notice a way more serious decline of 22.4%, with nearly 42,000 units sold in the third quarter. Reasons for decline are various, and one of them certainly is the fact that the company hasn't offered many updates in the last couple of years, unlike rivals, which are now fresher, more appealing, and therefore more competitive. Still, the bigger reason is definitely the fact that interest rates on auto loans have remained very high, even though the Federal Reserve acted to lower its rate recently. Unfortunately, that didn't affect auto loans at all, so high rates still remain an ongoing problem, a thing that killed affordability. GM's big disappointments. Every now and then we can hear about the progress in the EV sector. GM did make a notable improvement in terms of sales numbers with a massive jump of 45% compared to just a quarter before. The Cadillac Lyriq is doing great and Chevy's electric models are progressing as well. But what remained under the radar in the recent report somehow was the disappointing performance of large SUVs that still rely on good old internal combustion engines. The thing is that while the EV sector still loses money and it's still away from breaking even, these large SUVs are some of the biggest profit generators for the company. Well, apparently they're not as popular as they used to be. Let's check those numbers. Let's start with the Chevy Suburban. The iconic full-size SUV has been around for decades and it's been a steady seller for a long time, but not anymore. Chevy sold a bit over 9,000 units during the third quarter, which represents a massive 25% drop compared to the same period in 2023. The Suburban's smaller sibling, the Tahoe, also recorded a notable drop, with 23,337 units sold during the third quarter, which represents a 15.4% drop compared to last year. Finally, the midsize crossover Traverse has also underperformed, with 28,390 units sold, which would be a 12.2% decline compared to last year. Things at Cadillac aren't much better either. Most of its crossover SUV lineup has been slow selling for years, but now even the body-on-frame Escalade has dipped to less than 8,800 sales in the third quarter, an 18% drop compared to last year. Then comes GMC, which did improve in the pickup truck sector, but recorded a notable 8.6% decline in the case of the Yukon, with a bit over 19,300 units sold. Finally, things at Buick haven't been great for a while, and now one of its most important models, the subcompact Encore GX, also went down to 14,675 units sold in the third quarter, which is almost 27% lower compared to the same period in 2023. China troubles. GM used to be a dominant force in China, but for years sales have been in decline as GM grapples with significant challenges. Just in the first quarter this year, the automaker posted a $106 million loss, and to give you a better perspective, that's the third quarterly loss in 15 years and the largest one if we exclude the pandemic period. Simply, this is the outcome of a decade-long decline in profits and market share, with market share shrinking from 15% in 2015 to 8.6% in 2023. Since its peak 10 years ago, profits plummeted 78.5% due to geopolitical tensions and, more importantly, intense domestic competition. Sales from US-based brands like Buick and Chevrolet are down, while the company's reliance on joint ventures with partners like SAIC Motor and Wuling Motors is becoming more and more evident. Last year, the company sold around 2.1 million units, and 60% of them were co-produced with Chinese companies. The biggest problem is electrification, as the Chinese government is pushing really hard to change the preferences of Chinese buyers. So GM now has a new strategy to target premium buyers with models like the Hummer EV and Buick GL8 plug-in hybrid. However, GM's problem in China is much deeper and reflects broader challenges that Western automakers face. GM already exited various markets like Europe, India, and Russia, so it doesn't surprise that some experts are now talking about the possibility of the same scenario in China. For now, GM plans to try to consolidate by leveraging its luxury and EV offerings, but will this be enough to remain competitive against government-driven domestic automakers, and for how long, it's hard to say. All we can say at the moment is that GM's future in China doesn't look particularly bright. Still away from profitability. Although GM is making some progress in the EV sector, the company is still miles away from becoming profitable. Yes, sales numbers are much better than before, but nowhere near as planned. Remember that 1 million EV plan? Earlier this year, Barra announced a plan to sell 300,000 EVs in 2024. A couple of months later, that plan was revised to 200,000 to 250,000 EVs, but now it's still uncertain if EV sales are going to reach 200,000 units this year or not. But sales aside, GM has much bigger problems. We already talked about the need to save $2 billion, which will be achieved through, along with other cost-saving methods, layoffs. It's problems that come with trying to break even. Because although not as much as Ford, GM is still losing big money on the EV program, and you won't find a better indicator than the company's decision to postpone the electric truck plant in Michigan for the second time, with the opening now rescheduled for mid-2026. Meanwhile, cheap competition from China is working its way to the US market, where GM needs to lower its prices to keep pace. One of the problems is technology, as GM still uses old nickel cobalt manganese batteries, which are notably more expensive compared to lithium iron phosphate battery technology. Officials did announce plans to switch to cheaper batteries, but that's still on a long stick. In the meantime, GM will have to make EV production more effective to cut the costs, and according to experts, that will inevitably lead to new rounds of layoffs. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.